to Vital Psychedelic Conversations. My name is Johanna and I'm the coordinator of education and training, and I'm here with two wonderful guests to talk about something very interesting. I will introduce the topic in a moment. I just wanted to let you know that the applications for our fourth round of Vital are now open. We are launching our next cohort on the 16th of September. And this year we are also introducing 5 different specialization tracks. So if you would like to learn more about the program, please go to our website. The link is in the bio. And the reason why I'm doing this podcast today with this particular guest is to deepen our understanding of Jungian psychology. So Dr. Ido Cohen and Maria Papaspyrou are both experts in Jungian lore or philosophy or psychology, if you may. And we have connected many times in the past around this subject. And now we're also offering Jungian and depth psychology as one of our orientations to really help you unlock, like, how does it help you to understand psychedelics through this particular lens. So please go to our website, learn more about the program. Applications are open until 23rd of August. And without further ado, I will go forward and introduce our guests for today. So Maria, let's start with you. We have known each other for years. We met in the UK through the Breaking Convention conference. So Maria is a senior accredited psychotherapist working in private practice in Brighton, UK. Her core trainings have been in integrative relational psychotherapy, systemic family constellations, and supervision. She has had a long-term interest in the healing potential of expanded states, and her clinical practice focuses on psychedelic integration and working as a supervisor for individuals and organizations in this field. She is a co-editor of Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine and Psychedelics and Psychotherapy, The Healing Potential of Expanded States. Maria has co-founded and co-directs the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, IPT, where she has co-developed and teaches a 2-year professional training on psychedelic-assisted therapy through the depth relational process model. And yeah, we were just talking. Was it your second cohort that you're running now?
We've started our second cohort this March, yes.
Amazing. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about that also during this conversation. And then we have Dr. Ido Cohen, who you probably will have seen at this point. Ido has been teaching for us for years. He did the fantastic Shadow series. He serves individuals, couples, and groups in San Francisco, received his PsyD from the California Institute of Integral Studies, and trained at the Jung Institute in San Francisco. He works with a diverse range of challenges: childhood trauma, inner critic, relationship and intimacy challenges, lack of fulfillment, psychospiritual growth, as well as psychedelic integration and preparation sessions with individuals and groups. His doctoral study researched the integration process of ayahuasca ceremonies while applying Jungian psychology to better understand how to support individuals in their process of change and transformation. He's currently finishing a study on the use of psychedelics in couples. He's the founder of the Integration Circle and facilitates workshops on the different dimensions of integration and the intersection of mental health, spiritual health, and the entheogenic experience. Ido is passionate in supporting individuals to create long-term sustainable change, leading to intimate, authentic, expressive, and love-filled lives. In his free time, he likes to find new paths in nature with his dog Luna, marvel at art, write, and create and connect. So amazing to have you both here. And
Thank you for having us.
I am so excited for this conversation. So today we're going to be talking about our parts, the multiplicity of the self, and different aspects of the psyche and how they become visible through psychedelic work, and how the potential of these parts is best manifested, how they're integrated in the safest and most effective and most healing way. And I cannot imagine any two people who would be better at to talk about this subject than you two, because you both have such extensive experience in doing couples work, in doing individual work, and you both use the depth psychology lens. So let's get going here. First, just to learn a little bit more about you. Um, when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about two characters, and one of them was, or is this Portuguese poet called Fernando Pessoa. And if you don't know him, there's the saying that three best Portuguese poets are Pessoa, because he wrote under 100 different heteronyms. And heteronyms are basically literary characters, but they each have their own individual lives. They have their own personas, and they have their specific writing styles. So I had the opportunity to visit a museum, which was his old home in Lisbon, a few weeks ago, and I have loved his writings for years. And I was just so touched again by the sort of immensity of his character, and the kind of the depth and the breadth um, of the different personalities that this person was embodying. I mean, in real life, he was a relatively isolated character who lived all his life in just few quarters of Lisbon, and probably on many stretches of measure lived a relatively uneventful life. But he had this incredibly rich and deep connection with all of these different personalities, and his poetry is just incredible, as well as his prose. And all of Portugal is just so proud of what he has accomplished, even though he only really became famous. Well, he only published one piece of writing in his lifetime, and everything that he published was after his death, and he never really received the recognition that he should have during his lifetime. But he's very, very well known and loved in Portugal now. So I was just thinking about him, and then I was also thinking about Jung, as always, and the kind of the story that he tells in his autobiography about when he's sitting in a rock, and he's sort of recognizing this sort of dilemma of like, is he the rock, or is he himself who's sitting in the rock? And he's kind of contemplating this question. And I don't know how old he is in this when he's recalling this tale, but there's this sort of recognition that of from a young age that there are these different parts in our psyche. And so I thought, okay, it would be really interesting to get together with you two, and to actually have this conversation about the multiplicity of the psyche, and the breadth of our inner experience. So, with that, I would like to ask you both a question. So, thinking about these multiple parts that we have, what have been your earliest or the most powerful experiences where you have experienced this multiplicity of yourself, and what was the impact of that experience? And Ido, we'll start with you.
Ugh. Well, thank you for having Johanna. Um, yes. I think as a child I was starting to get aware because I would notice that I would be like I was an athlete. So I noticed that when I was playing basketball, for example, I was very confident and felt very assertive. And then in other settings, I would get very insecure or shy. And I remember starting to kind of notice this differences and like, wow, it's when I'm here, I'm like this. When I'm there, I'm like that. And just wondering why that's like that, and how can I bring some of my basketball persona to my when I'm in a social setting with that there is, I don't know, a bunch of people. And but it wasn't as, psychologically clear as it is now. But I can share that my first ever ayahuasca experience, um, which I was not prepared for at all, although I thought I was prepared, but I was not. At some point, I was suffering a lot, and I remember there was this moment where I felt like I was just falling, and anything that I tried to grasp on, my spirituality, which has, prayer and this, it was all like Fabergé, like Dali's melting clocks. I would grasp onto that, and it would just melt in my hand, and I kept falling. And I would try to bring my family in, and that kept fell apart. And at some point, I was so terrified that I heard this voice say, "Well, obviously you're not ready. What do you want?" Like you get to choose one thing. What do you want? And I blurted out in my psyche, sanity. And then what happened is I was transformed into a room that had, I don't know how many TV screens, and every TV screen was a part of myself. So if you watch the second Matrix movie, it's exactly the same scene where he meets the architect. Very similar to that. And I could feel the nuance and pain and personality of every one of these parts of myself. It was
Mm.
incredibly overwhelming, but very profound. And I was just thrusted into this room, and then I would get thrown into this void that was incredibly peaceful. And that went on. I would be like thrusted between these two rooms over and over for who knows how long, because and in that space time is very slippery. But that was that like really settled for me the or I shouldn't say settled, it gave me an embodied experience of a psychological understanding that we all have parts and this, but I was like, oh wow, this is what it feels like to experience the multiplicity of parts. And this is what it would feel like if I really visited each part and tried to get to know them personally, and to really start recognizing the amount of emotion that was stored in each one of these parts and how they all have a story and a character. So I think that was the first really uh, transpersonal experience of knowing intellectually what parts are and what part work is, but then really feeling it on a very deep level.
Amazing story. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And what about the last piece of the question? So, what do you think was the impact of that experience? Well, obviously, you became specialized in Jung, and
It was very humbling. I think the first response was just humility. I was like, oh wow, look at all this. Like if you really want to explore your psyche, this is probably what would it mean to like really start doing this very slow, deliberate work of picking, reconnecting, because it's all relational for me. So reconnecting and creating a relationship with all these parts. And also very humbling. I was like, wow, there's a lot of parts I don't want to reconnect with. I do not want to own my, the moments where I'm selfish or inconsiderate or impatient, or that I'm more shy or insecure than I thought that I am. But also like really powerful parts of myself that I didn't even know there. I got glimpses of parts that only in the years to come after I would reconnect with them. So I think it was very sobering in the fact of like, again, taking an intellectual understanding and making it very real. It was also really humbling to really look at myself and be like, wow, there's a lot that I'm pushing against, both overwhelming and hard and challenging, but also beautiful. That's going to and authentic, and really kind of having to accept that exists in me and having to start working with that. It's a really big shift for me, really big moment.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's kind of the perfect gateway into this podcast, because you have this personal experience of a psychedelic induced mystical type experience where you really viscerally felt all of these parts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Maria, what
Mm.
about you?
Mm.
What has been your earliest, most powerful experience, and what has been the impact of that?
Mm. Well, firstly, wow, Ido, what a powerful visual journey. Incredible, incredible. What a beautiful image the psyche brought up to open you up. Amazing intelligence. So I think like most of us, I went through life thinking that I'm supposed to be one personality, a unified kind
Mm,
of person that is a solid, pretty consistent entity, and of course that's not the case at all. And I think it was when I first entered therapy that I started realizing that there's a lot more complexity there. And I think there's something about entering a place that, as its premise, holds the value that everything is welcomed. Everything is welcomed. Everything can enter the space. Everything can be related to, as Ido said, everything can be related to. And it was a really important piece of work around getting to know myself and allowing complexity and allowing different aspects of self to emerge for me to get to know them a little bit better. So the first such opener for me was my first therapist that started showing me that there are many aspects of myself that he was able to hold in the space and allowed me to hold in return. And then, of course, psychedelic experiences or expanded states came in, and there were more visceral encounters with, what you might call shadow in the Jungian sense, really difficult journeys of getting to see things that contradict completely who one thinks they are. Getting to understand the way perhaps I turn up in the world, and how that has adapted from early experiences. So getting to understand the different layers of the psyche in more visceral encounters, in different journeys. And all of that gave me a sense of self, but there was something that remained quite biographical. It remained somehow rooted in things I had experienced, things that had happened to me from birth to now. The last layer of that, I think, was my systemic constellations training, where I started understanding the multiplicity of self that went back a few generations. It's that body of self started opening up. So the parts were no longer just my parts. There was a sense of multiplicity of self that was intergenerational, or systemic, if you like. So it was parts of self that emerged out of my belonging to different systems. And that was a really instructive widening of what self meant. I think these different layers bring different perspectives, different ways of seeing things. In the end, the idea of self as a unified entity just doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't hold. It doesn't allow enough scope for understanding how complex we are as human beings. So I haven't done parts work, I haven't done IFS work. I'm familiar with the work of IFS and the general underpinnings of it, but it's been through, and they really brought a popularization of the understanding that we are parts, and we can negotiate or relate or dialogue with different aspects of ourselves. But I think every modality of psychotherapeutic work and thought has some kind of parts work in it.
Maria, thank you so much. For those of who don't know what family constellations work is, would you mind just giving a little bit of a background to it? And it's such a fascinating modality, and I love everything that you've just said around, how these different therapeutic methods that have become very popular are essentially around this theme of us having more than one part, and how its growth in popularity also shows that we are kind of moving forward from this idea of us needing to be a unified whole and actually really getting the allowance, and that is very tied to the psychedelic experience. But yeah, so if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about the family constellations, just since that's kind of your specialty to a degree.
Johanna, that's such a hard question to answer. Because it's
Sorry.
such a wonderful experiential modality that it's very hard to put it into words. But I think the basic premise is an understanding that we are intrinsically part of firstly family systems, but many systems. From our gender, our ethnicity, our religion, all of these things tie us to certain kinds of collective conscience, and we have deep loyalties to the systems, and out of these deep loyalties to the systems, we absorb some values of how to be, how to exist, how to behave in the world, that remain largely unconscious. And it's a wonderful experience and modality for starting to untie some of this knots and threads, and understand what of our intergenerational wounding. I mean, it's about a
Mm,
lot of it is about trauma work. What intergenerational wounding we might be carrying forward into how we lead our lives, and how can we differentiate from our systems, to use a Jungian lens. How can we differentiate from our systems enough so that we can lead our lives in a way that doesn't repeat unresolved patterns of wounding and pain that our ancestors perhaps didn't have the enough resources to resolve. In a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very mysterious. Yeah, the connection between psychedelics and these different parts is also very fascinating. And I think that the sort of the rise of Jungian psychology and people's interest in it, people's interest in the Red Book, and the kind of general acknowledgement that we can tap into so many aspects of ourselves, the spiritual side being one thing, but just all these different types of archetypal realms is whole another. So I would just love to hear both of your perspectives on what do you think is the connection of psychedelics and us discovering our different parts. And I know it's a broad question, but yeah,
that's a
just
great
take,
question.
yeah.
Maria, I'm gonna let you start now.
I think I just spoke too much.
Okay, I'll do it. I was thinking about it because I like to go back to the origin of words and to really reconnect with the origin. And I'm thinking about psychedelic, which is uh, revealing the psyche made visible. Right? That's the etymology of that word. It's a revelation of the psyche. So psychedelic, by definition, is supposed to help us reveal the psyche as a whole. And the psyche is not your mind, right? We kind of lost a little bit of touch of the fullness. And Maria, since it comes from your culture, you can probably explain better than I do about what the psyche actually is, right? But the psyche is something that has both, right, the mind, but also spirit. It's a lot more complex than just the psychological mind. So by definition, psychedelics are supposed to help us reveal ourselves to ourselves, right? So they're supposed to make the unconscious conscious. So just by that function alone, I think they are wonderful agents to help us uncover all those parts of us that we had to dissociate, exile, repress, oppress outside of consciousness because they're too painful, right? Maria, I love that you tied it to our intergenerational heritage, how so many of our parts are shaped or carried through the intergenerational link, right? Let alone what we are culturally shaped in, like how our gender shapes us, our sexuality, our ethnicity, all the stories that come with it. And that psychedelics help us reveal it. And that's something, again, Maria, you triggered, that activated that for me, because without that work, there is no individuation, right? We need to uncover all these parts to open the separation between the conscious and unconscious, as you would say, the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, to actually figure out who we are. Because for the most part, what we do is that we function in the world with an idea of self that's mostly based on other people's idea of who we need to be. Right? So I need to be the good kid who is always very either submissive, or I'm too identified with my rebel teenager because I grew up in an oppressive culture and family system. I, one thing that's been really interesting for me of late is how religious trauma in all its forms actually impacts people relating to their psychedelic experiences. Because there's a lot of association of my past religious experience with spirituality. So I don't want to hear about, oh, I took 3 grams of mushrooms and I met God. I don't like God. God has always been a painful, right? So again, but when I do that, what I'm doing is that I'm not noticing that I'm identifying with my rebel protector in that case. That's pushing against it. And I can't really allow myself to have a more authentic individuated experience of like, wait, if that was my experience and I met a God that defies all the other gods I've known, can I sit with it and start building a relationship with that and be like, wait, maybe there is different kind of, what if I let go of my need to protect myself? And obviously letting go is not that easy, but it's what if I work with the protector self, the rebel self, to allow that spiritual experience that I had to enter more deeply into my psyche, into my consciousness. So I think psychedelics, again, they are great at dissolving those protective structures we've put inside of us to keep away pain, trauma, and like we said before the call, even authentic parts of myself that I might not even know are there. Maybe I was trained to think that my sexuality is hetero, but actually through exploration, I'm realizing that there is a bisexual part of me, but I'm not allowed to be in contact with that because that will disturb too many people or will disturb my idea of myself. Like, wait, what do you really no, that's too much. I don't want to. So open us up to reconnecting with both the shadow parts, as Maria said, right? The personal shadow or the collective shadow even, but also the golden shadow, the authentic, the beautiful, the unconscious individuation I'm not even aware of, the things that I will become, my gifts, my experimentations, my playfulness. So I think that would be my kind of beginning of answer in that.
Yeah, I think you nail it in the definition, and I really like how you bring psyche. We flattened it to mind, but it is psyche manifesting, and as you say, it's a it's a it's a it's a incredible direct link to the deep unconscious, and that is, well, wonderful, useful, frightening, intense, terrifying. It can be many things. Having access to this deep spaces, and it's a very direct way sometimes to access some really old pre-verbal states. It's a place where we can start remembering parts of self that we have no conscious recollection of, and no way of accessing just by conscious mind or will. We see people in the States going to some very primitive early material that is sometimes very difficult to sit with, early states of helplessness, hopelessness, despair, um, hunger, fear, abandonment. And it's very different telling a story about these early experiences if one even knows them, and it's very different having a direct visceral encounter with the spaces in a matter of a few hours and coming back from that. There's something incredibly powerful about that, and that's not to say that that's that there are risks that come with us, of course, and we'll sit with that a little bit later on. And there's also something very powerful about not just the visceral experience, but the visual imagery that comes from these states and these spaces. And I'm not talking fractals and colors, which I don't think they're irrelevant. I think they're also, I think there's something about the aesthetics that is also potentially a healing quality and dimension of the experience. There's something about beauty that touches chords of the psyche that are perhaps really important to. I don't necessarily think that there's nothing in the visual aesthetics, but I'm talking about deeper imagery, imagery that sometimes is archetypal, imagery that sometimes captures a moment the unconscious holds, that may be true, may be symbolic, but there's something about returning back with these gifts the psyche offers, and having the possibility to work with this material that is very hard to get to in ordinary talking therapy. And I'm a big proponent of therapy. I believe it is a really important space for working through things, for figuring life out. But there's some spaces that the psychedelic space leads us to that it's very hard to get to in ordinary talking therapy. And I think that's the gift of bringing bits back from these journeys and then doing the work of figuring out, I think that's what you're saying. How do they fit? Okay, that comes back, but how does it fit with the rest of me? And that could take a while, can take time to figure out how these little treasures can fit into what we already know about ourselves. And sometimes there's a radical departure from who we think we are, and that's a difficult journey. And sometimes there's a relief to find some of these parts and know that maybe we are something different than what we thought. But there's so much energy the psyche invests in keeping certain parts of ourselves away from consciousness that becomes released and available to us once we can stop defending against certain images, some information, or some parts of ourselves. So there's some life force that can become newly available to us once the psyche can stop defending against some of these aspects that, either we were unaware that they were there completely, or we were partially conscious of and didn't want to acknowledge.
Amazing. Wow. Thank you. Thank you both so much. There's so much to what both of you just said. And I think it just goes to show how deep this topic is. I mean, it's kind of everything, isn't it? I was just thinking about this. Um, I love the word remember, because it's like that we're remembering. We're always bringing back things, but it's like they're these archaic pieces that we couldn't fathom to be part of ourselves maybe a few years back when we were a little bit younger. And it's kind of a liberation to be actually able to own all of these different parts. But like you said, Maria, it's like that process is not necessarily easy. It's something that can take years and years, and it might have ups and downs, and sometimes it feels like it's a joyous process. Sometimes it feels like it's very arduous. But yeah, I would love to touch a bit more on that process of change, and how in your work you've seen that change occur in your clients, how you've observed that change in yourself, if you want, um, and the kinds of challenges and risks that it posed to be able to own all of these different parts little by little. So yeah, I would love to hear you both speak on that a little bit.
I think I would really want to pick up on what you said, Maria, as far as like life force, right? That I think psychedelics are such a psychopump for Eros. Eros is life force, and life force comes the way it comes. And we talked about it before the recording, that you talks a lot about how the capital S self, from which all experience comes from, always comes with demands. It's like wants to be recognized, wants to be related to, wants to be integrated. And to how important it is to enter into a psychedelic space with that in mind. I'm coming in as one thing. I can't change and not change at the same time. We can't be, as opposed to, how a lot of psychedelics are marketed right now. You can't design your experience. You can't design how much of the unconscious is going to enter and life force is going to come into your psyche and have all kind. You can design those revelations. So I think as far as risk and benefits, um, I would put that in the risk and benefit category. That one of the risk is you're opening yourself up. And this is before we even talk about the shamanic realms where you deal with plants and you're opening yourself up to entities in archetypal dimensions that they don't need your permission to come in. They come, they do what they need to do, they go. Then we have possessions and all kinds of other things that we can talk about. Um, but the risk is really coming with that state of mind. Like I am going to enter into a space and I'm going to, like you said, Maria, like open myself up to see, connect, relate to experiences, memories, archetypal energies, parts of self that I may not even know they're there, or they may hold a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of powerlessness, a lot of, um, that brings the idea of implicit memories arising in psychedelics, which I see as part of it. So going with some other mode where I can control the experience or I can, nitpick what I want to experience and what I don't, I think can be really risky. And also needing to develop the emotional, somatic, transpersonal tools to navigate those spaces. How do I stay in a state of, hopefully in a state of curiosity, in a state of having an experience, and maybe I can be curious about it. And if I can't, if I'm doing something guided, how do I know how to ask for help, to ask help to navigate, to have even sometimes help to stay embodied, as opposed to having old patterns of dissociation come up, or right being blown out of the water by a transpersonal experience.
Absolutely.
Um, So I think that's one thing that came to mind when I was thinking about it. Because we see, right? We see the extreme cases where it can develop into, worst case scenarios, a psychotic episode, and psychosis does exist with psychedelics, or manic energy, even like foster more dissociation. I worked with people who had complex trauma, and they came out of psychedelic experiences even more dissociated than before, because the content that they were connecting with was too unbearable and they didn't have the tools, right? The running image that I heard many of these clients talk about is, I felt like I was put on a surgery table, they cut me open and then they sent me off. And I think they're describing a psychic reality where they were just like really opened up. And Maria, you were talking about containers before. There is no container during, or obviously more important after, or as important, of the integration. Like, okay, you went through surgery, how do we support you? How do we remember? How do we put back the things that the surgery fixed? How do we stitch you up? What does that look like? um, or on the flip side, a lot of it can be all these archetypal possessions of inspiration or wanting to reset everything. I call it pressing the atomic reset button. I'm going to quit my job and live my person and move to another country. And it's like, wait. Without any conscious engagement with your experience, the material of the experience, how the relationship you had with your experience feels a week after. Do I want to just push it away? Can I sit with it? Can I think about it? Can I even talk about it? I think a lot of people, when it gets to the talking to someone else, that's where things can become interesting about the integration piece. And the last thing that came to mind, and I specifically to parts, and I think it's some way natural, but also we need to pay attention to, is when we start getting aware of all our parts, our inner child, and we start justifying behaviors because of the parts. Oh, well, my inner child is very wounded, so that's why I threw a fit. Like, don't be angry at me. or I have an inner jerk and it's because of my dad or my heritage, like the understanding. And it's subtle, right? And there's a difference between using the awareness to ask for compassion and understanding versus using it to weaponize your unhealthy behaviors or justifying unhealthy behaviors. And by that, actually keeping the complex alive and feeding the demon, quote unquote, what we call. You're just like feeding those the unconscious parts of yourself instead of gently, kindly, compassionately making them more conscious and being like, oh wow, look how much power that archetype, that part has on me. I get angry a lot for the same reasons over and over again. I should probably work with that. So that's what comes to mind when we talk about risks. Just to stick with that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing the defensive part in it, Ido, because it it's a tool can be used in a way that's useful, and it can be used in a way that just becomes really destructive and doesn't add anything that allows the person to grow and progress. And I also like what you say about curiosity. It's so important to stay curious about what emerges, because it just keeps us open. It just keeps us open to welcoming everything that comes into the space, which sometimes is really difficult. I mean, the demands of change can be really significant. It's we tend to overvalue the cognitive mind in the West, and we think that we can change on a cognitive level. We can put our mind to change. We can will ourselves to change. But there are much bigger forces when it comes to change, and sometimes that force is what Ido called self with a capital S. Sometimes self with a capital S is drawing us in a direction where our egoic smaller S self isn't sure that it wants to go towards. Sometimes we feel dragged towards change by a future version of self that is too big to fathom for the smallest egoic self, and we get initiated into change in a way that demands quite a lot from us, and these are the most difficult pieces of change. Sometimes deep process work can ask us to work through. And there's something about maturing that requires sometimes change that takes us a little bit apart, perhaps, in some ways. There's something about the maturation, individuation journey that sometimes, I think, again, you spoke to about, we have to disintegrate a little bit before we can
Yes.
reintegrate into a
Yes.
newer version of who we are. And there's something my colleague Tim Reed talks about that I really like when he talks about when the process gets stuck, and he talks about people being in the process and people being stuck in process. These are the people that have left the operating theater. They've left the surgery wide open. They haven't been stitched back up, and they've run out of the hospital, and they got stuck with an open wound, with an open process, without the tools, the containers that can help them continue the process to completion, and that can happen often through very challenging, very difficult psychedelic journeys, and it can happen to all of us. We can all get stuck in the process, and it can take a long while to realize that that's where we're at. How do we support these situations of change that require a good enough container or support system to move towards their completion? How do we support small s self to get nearer to big as self and its demands, as Ido said, the demands it places upon our conscious personality. So there's loads of parts there, There's the part of the biggest, the smallest, the operated part, the part
Hmm.
that's trying to catch up and isn't resourced enough, and then I also like what Ido says, which is a little bit about the possibility that all of that becomes just a bypass, the possibility that you get in contact with really big forces, like archetypal forces, but you do it in a way that inflates you as opposed to helps you process something. That you do it in a way that just adds a little bit to your defensive structures as opposed to helps you dismantle them a little bit more. And I think that the thing that makes the difference here is, as I just said, having another container where you can talk through things, where you can have a place to really think through things, um, with an external self, with a part of self that's external to you,
Hmm.
that can help you think these things through a little bit um, more, especially when things get tough, especially when change is a process that gets a little bit stuck because it's so big that we can get a little bit of indigestion. It's hard to do it in one go. It requires bites and steps and digestion, and it takes time. Change is a process that takes time. And sometimes it takes repeated exposure to expanded states and gradual adjustments in the life we live and the structures we have in life. It's something that we shouldn't take too lightly.
And I think that's such a really important piece, Maria, what you just said, that it takes time. I think one of the biggest shadows of the psychedelic world, which is borrowed from the capitalistic world, is this idea that if we just invest enough money in research, we can find a way to make it take less time,
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
right? So we're going to solve the human mystery in 3 ketamine sessions and heal all those 45 years of trauma. And then, even maps is and I love maps. I have no issues with maps, but even this idea that we're going to live in a trauma-free world by 2048 or whatever that date was,
Mm.
I think comes from the same deep archetypal wish of humanity to find a way to extinguish suffering.
Yes.
And I don't think that's, and it is in a way right, a rejection of shadow. It's like, I don't know. We have Buddhism, right? Buddhism said life is suffering. So why are we why are we kind of arguing with that in such a way, right? So really, but I think it's part of our job as educators is to be curious about this wish to abolish suffering when people come to us. And when they get frustrated, the process is not moving fast enough. It's not getting where I want to. It's like, where are these statements actually? Because they're coming from a part. Usually they come from a part that's been suffering or neglected or even abandoned for too long. So it comes off as frustrated, as angry, as demanding. Right? If there's a demand on the psychedelic to help me get somewhere fast, which if we break that apart, it's like, how can you demand of a psychedelic to get you anywhere, of a plant to take you anywhere? Where's this wish coming from in you? So I think it's a really good point of like process. The psyche is organic, right? The psyche has organicity. You talks so much about how the psyche is like nature. It has seasons. It's impacted by the weather. It has its own natural rhythm. And we have developed this idea that we can disrupt, interrupt, and bully the psyche, literally, to get somewhere because we can't deal with the pain or we're frustrated with it. So I think
Just
that's a
another.
really important piece. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah, I was
really
just
important piece. Yeah.
Hmm.
I really agree. And we've borrowed it from the medical model that tries to eradicate illness. And we have turned mental health to something that should be solution focused, but we need to be thinking about process oriented treatments where people keep engaging with the process. It's an ongoing commitment to growth. It's not a one off. I have anxiety, I'm going to treat it, and I'm not going to have to deal with anything that has to do with self anymore. It is such a miss. So hopefully psychedelics, and you're right, Ido, it's how do we what narrative frames do we put around this kind of work? And if we put the same
Mm-hmm.
narrative frames that the medical models have dictated for so long, then we're just going to misuse it's again a tool that gets underused or misused, as opposed to really allowing our paradigms to change here. This is the invitation they offer us as a field. We have the possibility as a field to evolve into a more process oriented frame. So also people don't feel like they have failed when they haven't found the solution to the
Hmm.
problem, but they have entered
Yes,
just a growth path.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a big one. I've met a lot, right? A lot of people that I work with, their inner critic hijacks the experience. And it's like, oh, you failed, and I've heard the most artistic explanations, and I do it in myself. I didn't prepare right. Or if it's people who, work with plants, I broke my diet, I ate too much salt, or like really creative ways in which the critic is like basically using the psychedelic experience to feed into shaming,
Mm,
to
mm,
feed into, right, low self-esteem, to keep pushing the narratives that are fueling depression, that are fueling anxiety, insecurity, whatever that is.
mm, mm,
Absolutely.
mm,
Wow, so many important parts, and yeah, I'm wondering which one to touch upon and go forward with. I think this piece about the shame and the self bullying and the kind of um, anxiety that people have when they're entering into this space to have. I mean, to be honest, as a culture, we're also so obsessed with self improvement at the moment. It's almost like this kind of like this, just have it in the back of your head. You go on social media and there's like reel after reel of these 5 a.m. morning routines, sometimes 3:30 a.m. if you're really on it, and just like to kind of like cultivate the absolute best versions of ourselves that are like always on top of the game. And it's like, what's the role of self-compassion there? How can we actually tap into those parts that are actually like, you know what, it's it's okay to not to be okay sometimes. It's okay not to always be able to live at your highest potential. Um, and I think it's especially important in this whole psychedelic work because it's such a new avenue. And the thing is that we don't really, as educators and you as practitioners, it's like to talk about making mistakes. It's quite hard because the um, obviously the risks are very real, and it's such a significant impact when you do the wrong thing. But at the same time, we're all going to be making those mistakes. So yeah, I would love to hear your perspectives on that. Um, like how, Maria, you work with so many students at the moment. Like, what are the sort of most common ways in which you see like your students working through themselves while they're wanting to become other people who can guide others or help others? And yeah, how are you implementing that?
mm. So I don't think we can do this work. Well, firstly, I don't think this is necessarily work. In that going into this vocation is a path, is a calling of some kind, and I don't think it's something you do on others. I think it's something that you do because there's something in you that's calling for an ongoing inquiry into the human condition. So I don't think you can do the work out there and neglect what's in there. And I think every piece of work you do out there is at the same time a piece of work in here. You know that there's no line that says this is the patient and this is the expert. That there are sure, there's someone that holds space perhaps and has extra responsibility for making sure the space is safe and someone's pressing needs take priority, but it's a space where two psyches meet and are in dialogue with each other and are in a relational dance with each other. So I think the most important thing for people, the people that train to do the work, for us, the students we work with, the most important parameter is that they engage deeply with the work. And the invitation is to do a 2-year journey that is a personal journey, that one learns to, of course, support others in expanded states, but opens a really deep inquiry into themselves, are in therapy throughout this process, understand that we open a container with adequate support for processing, understand that the work that happens in community and group setting is of a different power to the work we do in isolated settings. And I think the most important thing that we hope they understand is that the fundamental bedrock of doing this work is relational. That
Mm.
this work rests on relationship, and when these relationships form in a sufficient way, then the person can allow themselves to drop a little bit deeper into their work.
Yes.
Deep work requires relational containers. So that is the relationship within the group. As this group gets to know each other, this few people get to know each other and enter expanded states 4 times in 2 years with each other. The work that gradually builds and develops is is resting on this relational field. It's not just a psyche we work with. We work with the relational field always. And it's really moving to see what happens in intentional community. It's really wonderful to see what the power of 20 psyches working together is, as opposed to this isolated idea we have of healing in Western society. So I guess that's one thing that comes top of the list: adequate support, constant attention to inner work, um, learning from mistakes. Again, that thing of everything needs to be welcomed. I like that Ido brings the question of shame in the mix. It's so vulnerable to reveal ourselves to others in this state. We have to know how vulnerable it is if we are to guide other people into that space. We have to know what a tender, intimate act it is to allow someone to see us in that space, so we can then reciprocate with that sensitivity, um, really deeply installed in us, and community, for depth, for relationality, for accountability, for all of it.
Mm,
Beautiful.
beautiful.
I
Yeah,
think
you're
it.
making me think. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think you go ahead.
Well, a few things, Maria. You're making me think about that necessity of that Jung quote that therapy is two alchemical, right? That the two people are like two alchemical components, and if they don't, they have to be mixed so they both transform. If only one of them, then it's not really meshing, right? And I think that is something important to talk about because I think there is a very big identification. There can be a very big identification with being the shaman part of yourself or the healer part of yourself, and somehow thinking that you're like on the side operating on the process, as opposed to the fact that you are part of the process, and that's, shaman part of you is actually expressed through your ego, which is what expresses your personality. So all the things that you haven't treated in your other personality parts are gonna interrupt, right? I was just talking with Kyle, Johanna. I'm gonna make a plug for the course that we're gonna start in October, which is the Shadow Course 202. And we were talking about, um, I don't remember her name, but the chart of the 7 centers of shadow and practitioners. So like starting
Higher
with
attainment.
sex.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So thank you. And right, so like looking, and we were like, how can we utilize that image to really work with the practitioners who are going to come to the course to go like, wait, what's your relationship with sex? Right? In the therapeutic, in the relational space, and first with yourself. What's your relationship with money? Right? We see most of the perpetrations in the psychedelic world are somehow either related to money or to sex and love. Right? Obviously, power is always in there somehow. Um, so yeah, our need to like really know ourselves, and not as a cliche, but like really as an ongoing practice. Why did this particular client trigger me so much? Why do I love them so much? Why do I don't like them so much? Why was that particular part where they were expressing this movement or that thing was so impactful for me? Am I in a good enough space to even sit for someone right now? Maybe I'm going through a lot. And can I own that? Not be ashamed of it, but like really see that as, right, a natural part of my being an ethical practitioner. So I think all this to say that I'm really stressing the relational field, like Maria is saying. And the relational field is my relationship with myself, is my relationship with my vocation, my calling, right? We know that most therapists, practitioners, facilitators, most of us work on deficiency, right? We're emotionally overburned, or we're trying to navigate multiple lives and selves at the same time, which sometimes takes a lot of energy. And so relationship with ourselves, relationship with our vocation, and how are we in relationship with people? Just because they're named clients or whatever you call them, they're still people. How are you with people? And then, of course, our relationship with the plant world, the archetypal world, the transpersonal world. Um, and that is our school, right? That's our school of growth. That's how we grow. And if you're lucky, you have a supervisor like Maria who's going to help you grow with those experiences. Because we need someone who can see us just where our edges are, right? Where our consciousness kind of gets to the edge. We need someone to be like, hey, can you see what's on beyond, just beyond that edge? Can we look at it? Can I keep you accountable? Because you said you're going to take a week off, but 2 days have passed and you're back working. Like, what's happening? So yeah, that's what came to mind listening.
I love the accountability piece, and well, I think for me, I think the accountability and community are also something that are very intertwined. As um, through Vital, we're also growing this expanded network of different types of practitioners, and um, for me, also this formation of friendships throughout the course is one of the most important parts that can happen, because it's like it's not just when you form professional alliances, but when you actually genuinely want to know what is going on with another person on multiple levels and they do the same for you. And that's when you create accountability, because you see others and you see their downfalls, and in a sense you create the safety network where, you know, even people who would maybe have the potential to be perpetrators could maybe be caught in advance, because there's a network that says, you know, maybe if instead just working alone and not being associated with anyone, not having mentorship, you actually are in this grid. And that's something that I think is one of the most effective ways to prevent harm. And I think there's studies to show that most of these perpetrators in therapeutic work are oftentimes working alone for years. They don't have friends, they don't have those types of networks, and um, that's why building support groups is so important. What you're doing, Maria, doing so much this sort of very intensive learning through your course. And so what you're doing, Ido, building our Jungian hubs, and
Yeah, and
also,
we do consultation groups for the integration circle, and that's a big part of
yes,
why. A lot of the feedback we get from people is not I mean, it's also how incredible our knowledge is, but it's like, I never had a community of people who do this work. It's very insulated, it's very isolated. We had someone, and I always give the story because I give her so much credit. She was telling us about her work, and she facilitates DMT sessions, and she was telling us that she's going to do 10 sessions in the next 2 weeks. And the whole group were like, wait, what? And because she was so deeply related to her part of her that's of service, there wasn't a part of her that stopped being like, wait, is that right for me? And then when we started talking to her about it, not in a shaming way, but like, hey, can we open this up? What actually came out is that she is exhausted. She wants to serve these people, but actually she's exhausted, and what she needs is a vacation. So she moved from 10 sessions in 2 weeks to taking a month off. And it's only because she was really
Mm,
able to not go into shame
mm,
and be curious and open and receptive
mm,
and be really able to challenge the server part of her that was working on some unhealthy, operating system, and take a community of people in that are there to be of service to her. And sadly, that's pretty rare in the psychedelic space, to have really a community of people who want to think, reflect, engage with you as a server,
mm,
and hold us all accountable to the necessary ethics, self-care, right practice, right? Be really open. Absolutely. It's crucial.
yeah,
mm, mm,
that's why
mm,
we're building it.
mm,
Maria,
Mm-hmm.
do you have something that you wanted to add, Maria?
mm. Well, it's difficult, demanding work. I think people have this ideal sense of, I want to be a psychedelic therapist, but it's really hard work. And we are all uh, vulnerable when it comes to the ethics of our practice, because the field, the transferential field, is really loaded and amplified. It is really long hours of working when you work with someone in that space. Your ego gets tangled up. Am I needed? Am I not needed? Have I done this right? Have I saved them? Have I, the part of self that is so tempted to be miraculous and a healer gets
Mm-hmm.
activated. And the question of how do we get out of the way is a constant inquiry when you sit for people in the spaces. How can we actually get out of the way and let a person's inner healing intelligence and plant intelligence do the work. How much backup do we have? Ido, you're right. How much rest do we get? How much integration do we get for the work we do? How much of
Yes.
our work that comes up do we attend to? But we have had people that in the training realized that it wasn't so pleasant sitting for someone for all these hours, and not, and sometimes it can also be downright boring and uneventful, or frightening, and really intense. So I think the idea of the work versus the reality of the work, there can be a
Yes.
discrepancy between the two.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
also have
Go ahead. Yeah.
just a brief comment that we also, actually, we had Don came and he teaches for us as well, and he said in one of his lectures, he's like, I hope at the end of this talk, some of you will reconsider whether you want to be working with psychedelics at all. And then And then at the end of the program, I also think it's quite amazing. We've had a couple of people who wrote their final projects on how they don't want to any longer become psychedelic facilitators, and
Wow.
I think it's a victory because it's just
Yeah.
like, thank God, you're going a different path. You've discovered in yourself a kind of knowing that this is not what you want to do, even though because you were initially enchanted by these ideas of yourself, specifically being the savior, being the helper, being
Mm.
the incredible therapist, who is holding that space. And I think that's the little bit of the one of the important things that is going on right now, is that to really realize, like you say, Maria, the complexity and the heaviness and the depth of this work. It's really like, when it's almost become kind of like a cliche, this kind of a psychedelic therapist who has no integration time of their own at all. And I know so many people who do it, and they're incredible human beings, but it's like, when do they take when do they take time off? And what is the breaking point? Like, how much longer can we go on?
Mm. Mm.
Hmm.
Mm.
It's the old saying, the self is always going to humble the ego. Eventually you can't cheat your fates. Eventually it will catch up with you.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not now, it's a year from now, or when you're sitting with someone and they're all of a sudden starting to throw chairs around or whatever rage comes out of them, and you're like, "Ugh, I should reconsider my job. I didn't sign up for this. I signed up for, like, fairies and like archetypal fifth dimension beings, and I don't know about this thing.
Yes.
Um, so it's good. It's a good learn. It's good to
Mm.
be. I love that example, Johanna, because it really brings the idea of integrity. And integrity sometimes means to walk away. And that's not a failure, like you were saying, Maria. It's not a failure. If anything, you want to be as aligned with your individuation as possible. And if this is not the route, then maybe my right is to be a psychedelic advocate. There's so many forms of being in the space. Maybe I work for a company like Psychedelics Today, so I'm in it. I'm with the people who are in that frame of mind, who that's their life service. But I'm not running the sessions.
Mm.
There's diversity. So we need to expand the diversity of possibilities.
Absolutely. And we need everyone.
Maybe I
So,
help Johanna with logistics so she can be more.
Yes.
oh my God, I mean, please, everyone, help me with logistics. All hands on deck.
If you're listening and you want to be Johanna's helper, she's taking applications.
Yeah, no, no, truly. Um, so, well, this has been such a wonderful and heartwarming conversation with you both. We're sort of winding down towards the end of the podcast, and Um, I just really appreciate everything that both of you have had to say. It's been so interesting and so much deeper and more nuanced than I could have ever imagined when I was thinking about this topic at first. And so, yeah, I mean, do you have anything that sort of comes up to you now around this topic that we've already been covering? And then I will ask you both in one final question, and then we can sort of wind down here.
Yeah, the thought that there's a great book called My Self, My Many Selves by Jungian from like 85, I think. And I love that. The reason I love that book is because he talks about the psyche as a planetary constellation. And he says there's so many planets inside of you. We kind of focused on the parts that keep the shadow, but I want to bring back also, like, there are parts of you that are so wonderful and magical and magnificent and wise and creative, that are also out there waiting to be discovered. And we have to remember that too. It's not all about like searching for, the moons of Saturn, like all these like shadowy planets that are lurking in the door, Pluto, or all those undergroundy planets. I said that because of Johanna, because of her Scorpio connection. um, right? But there are planets there that are waiting with what is my purpose, my next creative project, my calling, my sexuality, my whatever. It doesn't have to be even that big, but so really bringing back this advocating for relentless curiosity and openness for discovery, and that should be the fuel to like be relentlessly curious and playful to try things out, and that this discovery process is to allow more playfulness, more eros, or yeah, like we said, more celebration of life, not to close life to make it harder or more burdening or overwhelming. Feels important to mention.
I love that.
Wonderful reflection, and it makes me think of the archetypal dimensions, the archetypal lens in life, the attention, not just psychedelic experiences, but to our dreams every night, and the imaginal, and there's so much richness around. And then that sense of the Jungian frame, which is, compared to analytic frames, it is exactly what you say, Ido. It's creative, it's playful, it's aligned with life force. And a note on future part selves that perhaps are pulling us forward into a way of becoming that we haven't yet
Hmm.
figured out, parts of future self that are out there in the mix of things that are pulling us into formation. And yeah, a note to include them too, not just the wounded parts. I like what you bring in, Ida. Yeah.
That's a wonderful thing to close this what felt like a start of a conversation, because again there would have been so much more to say. Um, but yeah, really just appreciating everything that you both brought. And as a final piece of this interview, I just wanted to ask you both. In your, I know you're both very busy and have so many things going on, but ending on that hopeful note, what are you most looking forward to in your own work now? What are you excited about?
I mean, for me, we're on a journey with 22 people that started in March and concludes next December, and I think most of my psyche is really engaged with that. And the first journey we did with 20 people was, reverberated through life in very powerful ways and asked of a lot of change. And I think every cycle builds on the previous cycle. So I think what I'm most excited in is continuing the journey. One more iteration of exposure to deep psyche.
Mm,
Mm.
Hmm.
thank you,
And
Marianne.
collaborations like this, coming into contact with like-minded colleagues. It's a real joy.
Hmm. Yeah. I think that the most immediate things is I'm very excited for the shadow offering that we're gonna offer through psychedelics today. To keep, like you're saying, Maria, developing more thoughtful, nuanced psychoeducation, psycho-spiritual education around these topics. So uh, to keep adding to the collective library that we're trying to create in this space, and that should be accessible to as many people as possible. And to also to the Jungian symposium in psychedelics that we're going to put together.
Yes,
I'm
yes,
saying it out
absolutely.
loud to make it happen.
Oh yeah, now
Um,
now now it's official.
it has to. Yeah, I really believe to keep. I love the work you're doing, Maria, and I love Johanna, your fire for this, and because I really do believe that that framework, that creative, imaginal, archetypal, relentlessly curious for me. I think Jungians are relentlessly curious, like sometimes even annoyingly. It's like, can we just make it like land somewhere? Um, has so much to offer. Has so much to offer. The theory and application of psychedelic therapy and psycholytic therapy and psychedelic philosophy in general. And I think we have so much more to explore there and to keep weaving together and finding the language and finding the structures. So I'm very excited to keep going down that route.
Yes. So you'll hear from us and about the symposium that Ido has envisioned that will absolutely now take place in sometime in this autumn. And also we'll put links in the description box about Maria's course and about Ido's shadow course and
Mhm.
links to their website and all of that. So thank you so much both. This was such a pleasure. And yeah, I look forward to reconnecting again when we do. I'm sure it's not going to be too long before we come up with something else. So thank
Thank
you.
you, Johanna. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you both.